Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Number one New York Times bestselling author John Grisham returns to Mississippi for his latest legal thriller, The Boys from Biloxi. The story of two sons of immigrant families who grow up as friends but ultimately find themselves on opposite sides of the law. For most of the last 100 years, Biloxi was known for its beaches, resorts, and seafood industry. But it had a darker side. It was also notorious for corruption and vice, everything from gambling, prostitution, bootleg liquor, and drugs to contract killings. The vice was controlled by a small cabal of mobsters, many of them rumored to be members of the Dixie Mafia. John Grisham is the author of 47 consecutive number one New York Times bestsellers. His recent books include The Judge's List, Sully, and A Time for Mercy, which is being developed by HBO as a limited series. He's a two-time winner of the Harper Lee Prize for Legal Fiction and was honored by the Library of Congress with their Creative Achievement Award for Fiction. It is a great pleasure to welcome John Grisham back to this week's book show. John, thank you very much for being here. It's always a great treat to speak with you.
My pleasure, Joe. Good talking to you again.
The Boys from Biloxi, there's a couple of things specifics that I want to get to, but before that, when you thought about Mississippi, did you realize that that was a place you hadn't written about for a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I knew I had not written about it. I've always been fascinated with Biloxi and its legend on the Gulf Coast. When I was growing up as a kid in Mississippi, I grew up at the other end of the state, far north, just outside of Memphis. I was 300 miles away from Biloxi, and we never went there on vacation. We never went to the coast down there. But I always knew of Biloxi primarily through Little League baseball. And back then, Little League was the dominant league in the country, and it was a big deal in my hometown to make the All-Star team as a 12-year-old. And this team was called the Biloxi All-Stars because you got to go to Biloxi for the state tournament. And every year it was in Biloxi, and every year Biloxi won the state tournament. You couldn't beat the boys from the coast. And I wouldn't know. I never made the All-Star team, Joe. I couldn't get enough votes. I wasn't good enough to be an All-Star, so I never got to go down there. But, I always knew of Biloxi for that reason. And then later, when I got to college and in law school, I started meeting kids from the coast. We just called them kids from the coast, and they were a lot more fun. It was a heavy Catholic influence as opposed to the rest of the state. The state's 92% Protestant, but the coast is heavily Catholic. A more laid-back, lifestyle, whatever. And then I started hearing stories about the legend of Biloxi, the legend of the coast, the corruption and vice and all that kind of stuff as I got older. And it was just was a very colorful setting, and I found it irresistible for a novel.
The time that really existed, it had a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? I mean, it was up until sort of the casinos came in that wiped that away.
Around 1990, Mississippi, quite by accident, and I know because I was there in the state legislature, approved casino gambling late one night when we were in debate on the floor. We accidentally approved casino gambling. The state would not even approve a state lottery. There's a huge anti-gambling sentiment in the state. This is hardcore Bible Belt Southern Baptist state, and gambling was never going to be approved, not even a lottery. Even after it became – they don't have one now. Still no state lottery in Mississippi. So horse racing and casino gambling were issues that came up occasionally. It was called riverboat gambling. And never had a prayer passing until, lightning struck, and we passed it in about 1989. And then that led to the construction of these huge Vegas-style casinos along the Gulf Coast and along the Mississippi River. And that really kind of put an end to the illegal gambling, the illegal nightclubs, strip clubs, prostitution, and also by then most of the old gangsters, the old Dixie Mafia guys, had either killed each other or gone to prison. And so there weren't many of them around anymore by then.
The novel, we read about Keith Rudy and Hugh Malco, but it takes us a while to get there because we read a lot about their fathers, who are they're both heavily influenced by, especially in Keith's case, where his father is one of the top law enforcers, not only in the region but in the state.
Yeah, both of those families, and this is historically accurate. Biloxi was settled around 1900 by the first wave of Eastern European immigrants, most of them from Croatia. And they settled there because they grew up working in the seafood business on the seas, fishing, and they congregated in Biloxi. And so a lot of Croatian immigrants. I still know several today. I was in law school and college with in legislature. I knew some of those people. And, by a generation or two later, they had thoroughly assimilated into the rest of the community. They were hardworking immigrants, and they built this incredible seafood industry about 100 years ago. And so they have a lot of colorful stories, a real sense of place and family and all that. And I was always, intrigued by that. And some went one way into the underworld, into the unlawful side. And most of them, though, were upstanding citizens who got involved in politics and law and everything else. And I thought it would be a nice contrast to take these two families, and one goes one way, one goes the other. These two boys who were inseparable when they were 12 years old become, on different sides of the law, and you can see it's not going to work out too well.
Hugh Malco's dad is Lance Malco, and he really becomes, in the novel, the boss of the criminal underground in this region in Biloxi. You write about the Dixie Mafia. There even in the author's note, you talk about that, of what it was like for real of the Dixie Mafia. When did that come onto your radar that existed?
Probably 35 years ago. In 1987, a sitting circuit judge in Biloxi, and his wife, who was a Biloxi City councilwoman, both obviously very active politically, very active in the community, they were both murdered in their home by a contract killer. And it was, as you might guess, a sensational crime. It took a while to solve it. And once they got suspects, and once the FBI, figured out the case, and they got the right guys, I started seeing for the first time the term Dixie Mafia. These guys the killers were part of the Dixie Mafia. And it became this really fascinating, almost lurid case that for many years just captivated Coast and people in Mississippi. And I think that's probably where the first time I heard the term Dixie Mafia. I'm not sure how involved these guys were with the Dixie Mafia. I don't think at the time they even called themselves the Dixie Mafia. There was a Dixie Mafia, but it was just a loose organization of thugs who operated from Texas to South Carolina for several decades, stealing everything that was illegal and involved in every kind of vice. Some tough guys who left an amazing trail of violence and dead bodies. And I think the legend kind of took over at some point. But they never had a hierarchy or an organization, or they weren't smart enough for that. They were just kind of thuggish types who ran nightclubs and fought each other. But the legend has become much bigger.
You don't make the direct connection in the novel, but it seems that at least it's suggested, and at least I got it, that there seemed to be at least some tie to New Orleans, to Louisiana, and a back and forth, if you will.
Yeah, I never could make that. I'm not sure that link has ever been made. There was a mafia crime boss in New Orleans. I can't even think of his name right now. He's been dead forever. But he had a real organization, and he was linked very strongly to the Kennedy assassination. Marcello, I think. But again, there were always suggestions that there were ties between the New Orleans mob and the Gulf Coast mob, but I never found that.
The name of the new novel is The Boys from Biloxi. John Grisham is the author, and the book is published by Doubleday. There's a moment in the novel, and it goes throughout really, of it's a relationship that's built between Jesse Rudy and the judge, Judge Nelson Oliphant. I thought this was a really interesting relationship in the novel because I had never really thought of it before, of what happens when you have someone as your district attorney, as you have someone as a prosecutor, that suddenly is on the side of the judge, and the judge realizes that.
It's not unusual, especially in places, probably smaller towns where the lawyers know each other better. Most of your judges, first of all, they're all elected, which is not a good system. Most states elect their judges, which is terrible. It's one thing I would change if I could, but it's not going to change. But most of your judges were elected as prosecutors, and so they have some, political base, a leg up when it comes time for a vacancy on the court. It's almost always a prosecutor, a district attorney, who gets elected. And most of the work is criminal work. So, again, the DA is involved in that. And the DA and judges, not always, but they often become very close because they just know each other. And they work with each other so often. They oftentimes have their offices in the courthouse almost next door to each other. And so, they can get very cozy. I saw it a few times when I was a young lawyer. I thought the judge and prosecutor, the district attorney, were a bit too close, and on some of the rulings, it seemed that as if the state always got a break. But I never saw it as a big problem. And I think most of the jurisdictions down there, they work hard at playing it fair in court and playing it fair with the cases, but they are close, and that's not at all unusual.
Because Judge Oliphant at one point tells Jesse, it's hard for me to be impartial.
Yeah, that happened after the famous Hurricane Camille in 1969, and I write about that in the book, when there were so many homes destroyed, people were killed. The devastation was catastrophic, and the insurance companies were horrible. They just refused to pay claims. They were so overwhelmed with the sheer volume of claims and the money they were going to have to fork out. There was a lot of litigation. I could not find a story of a lawyer 50 years ago who kind of took the lead in fighting the insurance companies. There was one lawyer after Katrina, but not after Camille. That part is very much fictional. But Jesse starts taking Camille cases and suing, and he exposes the really awful behavior from the insurance companies. And the judge is really turned off by what he is seeing, because so many people are suffering and can't get their homes habitable again, or they lost everything. And so the judge, who's a really good judge, good character, good honest guy, he can't help but feel sympathy for the people, the people who elected him, the people in his community. And so he really loses his objectivity and his impartiality in the litigation and favors Jesse, and he did the right thing. He helped force the insurance companies to start settling cases. That part's fiction.
In the case of that, the concern that Jesse has is, how do you prove whether it was water or wind that did the damage?
They had the same massive litigation going on after Katrina.
Right.
Probably most big hurricanes now. Although by now there have been so many bad hurricanes in the last 30 years because of stronger storms, but also because of so many more people living on the coast near the water. So the damage is always going to be more. But so many insurance companies now just won't even touch it. They don't even write policies anymore in those areas. And so the wind versus water has been raging for a long time. I don't know how it plays out now and Hurricane Ian just hit, massive hurricane, tons of damage. I'm not sure what the litigation is going to be there. I'm not that I haven't done my research.
It's interesting too, in the novel as it's passed down to the next generation, because we are reading about Jesse and Lance, and then it moves to Keith and Hugh, and the friends and the sons of those two who are on opposite sides of the law, and it's quite subtle actually, but then you have like the different white hat wearing DA and the bad guy.
Yeah, it's called storytelling.
Is that what that is? Yeah, storytelling. Yeah,
you got to have your good guys and bad guys, and you got to make your reader care for both.
Right. But it's generational in this case.
Yeah, and I've never done that before. Most of my novels take place over a period of a year or 6 months, or even a week. I've written a book that took a week. So they're short print stories, and I rarely stretch it out over decades. It's just real tricky to do. You have to go do a lot of research first of all and get things accurate, which I don't like to do. But I get kind of bored. I was really worried about the first chapter in this book, because normally in the first chapter of any legal thriller, I'm trying to hook the reader real fast and get the reader involved in the story and turning pages before you know it, it's midnight. That's what I like to do. This starts off with a brief history lesson about Biloxi and the seafood industry and the immigrants and all that, which I really enjoyed researching and writing, but I don't do that very often.
But it's still, it sets the immediate tone and brings you to that place. I thought it was fascinating. It's what, 5 pages, and it brings you to this point whereby, okay, then the second chapter, then we're ready to go.
Right. It has to be done. That's why it's not very long, and that's good stuff. I agree. It was fun to research. It's a really rich period in history for the people down there, and I love the stories of immigrants and the people who came here with nothing and walked away, left their families to never see them again. A lot of them, or came to live with family members here, and that's America.
The first thing, I think it was, I guess the second page, the first thing that I made a note of in the margin was a line that you have: journalists often found it difficult to believe that such illegal activity was so openly accepted in a state so religiously conservative. It's
92% or 94% Protestant, Bible Belt, extremely conservative when it comes to religion and politics, and always has been. And today in Mississippi, 82 counties, half the counties are still dry. You can't buy a drop of alcohol in half the counties. And the entire state was dry until 1964. Think about that. So when the story starts, in the nightclubs and bars in Biloxi, all that drinking was illegal. But even in the fine hotels down there, they had, lots of alcohol, bars, wine, everything was highly illegal. But you could go into a nice hotel in Biloxi in 1920 and have a fine meal and with plenty of booze and wine if you wanted, and then go play some illegal poker in the back room. that was how wide open Biloxi was way back then. It's incredible, and the rest of the state put up with it. A lot of the other people in the state would sneak down and enjoy it. There was always stories about people going to Biloxi and having fun, because you couldn't have any fun in your own dry county if you were so inclined. So, it's still incredible to me that went on for so long. And it was aided by the corrupt public officials who took the money and turned their eyes another way and let the crooks operate. And that went on for decades.
You talk about storytelling, but I mean, the sheriff's the real bad guy in here. I mean, the sheriff is in on everything, right?
Yeah. True story. True. I mean, modeled after a real guy. He long since deceased, but there was a notorious sheriff who was in office probably close to 20 years in the 1960s and 70s, and he was completely on the payroll of the lounge operators, the nightclub operators, and if you wanted to have a bar or a strip joint, in his jurisdiction in the county, all you had to do was pay him and open your doors. And he spread the money around, I think, to some of the other politicians, but he was by far the main culprit. Finally got caught and went off to prison.
John Grisham is our guest on this week's book show. The new novel is The Boys from Biloxi. I was working at an independent bookstore while I was going to college when the Firm came out. And man, that just changed everything. That was a book that just exploded. And I remember it coming out, and then all of a sudden there was this, he has another one too. And then A Time to Kill, is released shortly thereafter. And I just found it, from a bookseller's perspective, we were all looking at it going, man, this is such a neat story. Of course, your background as a lawyer and then as a writer. So what was it like to live that? Because it just seemed to be like a total dream of, well, here you are, you're doing this. The second book comes out and just explodes.
Yeah, you think you were shocked.
I can only imagine. It was unbelievable. We
didn't see it coming. When The Firm came out in 1991, the first printing was 25,000 copies, which is a very nice first printing. The buzz just there was a lot of pressure behind the book. People were talking about the book. I did a few book festivals, and there was a lot of interest in the book. Before it was published, they went back for 25 more, so we had 50 sort of in the pipeline with a lot of pressure behind them. And when it hit the stores, it just sold. And we had probably, 2,000 or 3,000 more independent bookstores back then than we do now.
Right.
And back then, they were crucial in the success of a rookie author. If they got behind a book, if your indies got behind your book, they could really make it or break it. And the indies got behind The Firm because it was just so much fun. They were hand selling the book to their customers, and it just took off. And it was overnight. And back then, when the book hit the big list, the New York Times list, as we called it, was long before the internet. If you were an unknown writer, new book comes out, and you hit the list, you're going to get a lot of attention. And as soon as we were on the list at number 12 on March the 17th, 1991, never forget that day, St. Patrick's Day, we hit the list, and everything changed. The book really went crazy then, and they couldn't print them fast enough. And then, like you say, if somebody said, hey, there's another book, well, A Time to Kill had come out 2 years earlier in 89. Small, unknown publisher. There was no buzz, no talk. They printed 5,000 hardback copies, and we couldn't give them away. It didn't sell. It never went back for another printing at that time, and there was no talk of a paperback or foreign rights. It was dead. It just flopped, okay? And then when The Firm came out, people like you, people said, hey, there's another book. And so Doubleday scrambled around and bought the rights to A Time to Kill and went to press immediately. And before you know it, that book was out too, and it became number one. And so that was just added, fuel to the fire. And then one of the smartest things I did as a career-wise was hustle up and get the third book out ASAP, and that was The Pelican Brief. And it came out a year after The Firm and, sold very well. And then, a couple of books worked, and then we had the first wave of the big movies. It's hard to imagine now, but the movie of The Firm came out 2 years after the book, which is unheard of. And the movies of The Firm, The Pelican Brief, and The Client came out within a span of 12 months. And they were all big movies with big cast and big box office grosses, domestic and foreign, and famous actors, and they're still on TV somewhere tonight. And it was really, it was a frenzy. It was a total. What was it like? It was hilarious. We were laughing the whole time. We were having a ball.
Well, it's a hell of a story. I have to say, my memory of it, and obviously you lived it, but as The Firm was coming out, Hollywood was already sort of on that, weren't they?
Oh, more than that. We sold the film rights before we sold the book rights.
Really?
When I sent the book to New York in the fall of 1989, my agent showed it to a few publishers. There was no big demand for it, and so nothing happened. And then a guy got a bootleg copy of the manuscript. A show popped up in Hollywood, and this guy got it out there. He made 25 copies and sent to 25 studios and production companies, and just having some fun with it. Well, he started getting offers to buy the book, the film rights, and he finally called us. I didn't know what was going on, and we sold the film rights to Paramount before we sold the book rights. It was a big story, and then suddenly all the publishers wanted the book, and so we had another auction. It was a lot of fun having the second auction, and here we go.
And there you go, and you got Tom Cruise starring in the movie. The other thing, and we'll end here, but I've thought this was interesting too, because A Time to Kill is a very personal story. I mean, that seemed to be, of all these books and of all these characters, the most John Grisham-ish story.
Yeah, I was living that life. I was 30 years old in 1985 when I started writing the book. And I had never written before, never thought about writing before, didn't know how to write, didn't know what I was doing. But I was a small-town lawyer in Mississippi, struggling to pay the bills and make a living, young wife who's having babies, so life was pretty crazy. But I was dreaming. I wanted to be a big-time courtroom lawyer. That was my dream, and I was inspired by some very fine lawyers in Mississippi at the time. And I wanted to be able to go into a courtroom and impress juries, and that's why I was living that life. I knew it so well, and so it was fun to put all that stuff in the book. A lot of it came out. The manuscript was 1,000 pages long when I finished, and we cut a third of it, which was a third. That's 1 year of my life they cut out. So I learned a valuable lesson. Keep the book short or shorter. It was rejected by everybody, and finally we got a very small unknown publisher in New York to print 5,000 copies, and I was, very excited about a new career. That lasted about a month when the book didn't sell. And I realized I had to keep practicing law for a while.
John Grisham's latest is The Boys from Biloxi. It is published by Doubleday. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next